Okay, welcome. Glad to have you here today. I'm Alan Hick, and I'm the director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, and we want to welcome you to this event today. We appreciate your patience as we got the room set up. We are really pleased to have with us today Dr. Caitlin Carter. Dr. Carter is a Weiser Emerging Democracies postdoctoral fellow. This is our second year of this fellowship. She's joining two other fellows here for this year and also next year. Her current she has a PhD in history from Princeton University, granted in 2017. Her current research is on state secrecy and representative politics in the 18th century Atlantic world. As a postdoctoral fellow this year next, Caitlin will be working on a book manuscript about the relationship between state secrecy and the first representative democracies, particularly looking at the U.S. and France. She'll also be working on her next project, which will be examining the problem of truth and trust at the founding of the American and French republics. Prior to beginning her PhD at Princeton, Dr. Carter received her BA with honors in history from the University of California, Berkeley, and also received an MA from Princeton along the way. We're really delighted to have her with us today. She'll be talking about the politics of secrecy in the age of revolution, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Carter.
Okay, thank you, Alan, and thank you all for coming out today in this cold afternoon. Can everyone hear me okay? I think so. Okay, great. So let's dive in. Shortly before the 2016 presidential election, WikiLeaks released a transcript of previously unpublished speech Hillary Clinton delivered behind closed doors, in which she reportedly said that politicians need to have separate public and private positions. You might recall this. The revelation intensified suspicion of what might be happening outside the public's view in an election already characterized by secrecy. Since then, Americans have been repeatedly, dare I say relentlessly, confronted with the question of when secrecy is and is not appropriately used by elected officials in a representative democracy. Senate Republicans were lambasted for a lack of transparency in drafting bills to repeal the Affordable Care Act, with many opponents citing the secrecy surrounding the process as a trick to attempt to pass unpopular legislation. The White House for some time stopped on-camera press briefings, you might remember, and has repeatedly suggested it may stop holding them altogether. Just get this. Democracy dies in darkness, the Washington Post now declares daily in its masthead. Clinton's leaked statement amounted to a candid answer to a question that has been fundamental to representative democracies since they were first founded in the 18th century. Which parts of the political process should be performed publicly? What does it even mean to perform politics? And what is the effect of having an audience on the political process? At root, what can legitimately be kept secret in a government that claims to represent the people? I would like to suggest that our answers to these questions come down to what we think it means for government to actually be representative. So my research is about how people in the 18th century thought about these questions and what their answers can tell us about how they understood and set up representative governments. An Enlightenment language of publicity and a growing concern with state secrecy permeated politics in the Atlantic world during the latter half of the 18th century. Suspicion of government secrets became central to mounting critiques of monarchical and ministerial power in the French and British empires on the eve of the revolutions that would rock them. In my book project, I contend that it is no coincidence that it was at this moment, the origin of modern representative democracy, that the place of secrecy in government was first widely contested and redefined. Questions of what should be publicly visible in politics were linked to evolving conceptions of what it meant for politics to be representative, and especially what it meant for representative government to be democratic. I argue that decisions and debates about the place of secrecy in politics during the Age of Revolutions shaped both the conceptual evolution and practical implementation of representative democracy in the Atlantic world. Now, because I want to give you a sense of the comparative and transnational nature of my work, instead of talking to you about one country, I'm going to talk to you today about 1 year. And that year is 1789, when the first federal Congress convened and George Washington was inaugurated in New York City. It is also, of course, the year that the Estates General met and seized sovereign authority as the National Assembly in Versailles, which is probably what first came to your minds. And if so, there would be good reason. It is the outbreak of the French Revolution that tends to mark 1789 as one of the most notable years in modern history. Despite the fact that new governments were being set up simultaneously in the United States and France, very few scholars have actually treated these developments in tandem. I would like to suggest that we can not only better understand what happened in each country if we treat them alongside one another, but that we can more fully comprehend the emergence and meaning of representative democracy, which has since become a pillar of Western society. Now, in my book manuscript, I apply this comparative framework to understand the evolution of representative politics from the early 1770s through the dawn of the 19th century. But like I said, today I'm just going to talk to you about 1789, which, to be sure, is a pivotal moment in my story. Looking at both countries makes 1789 look a little more revolutionary in the United States and contextualizes developments in France as one among other simultaneous efforts to reframe the basis of political authority. So other than the fact that contemporaries thought of these events in tandem, which I should say I think is sufficient grounds for treating them together, it is remarkable that 1789 marked the launch of two political experiments, both aimed at implementing representative government as a tool of popular sovereignty. And in taking this as a point of departure for my study, I am picking up where R.R. Palmer left off in the 1950s when he called the late 18th century the age of democratic revolution, on the grounds that revolutionaries in Western Europe and North America shared common goals and values. But what I aim to show is how these values were ill-defined, even contested, both within each country and certainly on the broader scale of the Atlantic world. Showing how representative democracy was not a monolithic concept, but was rather shaped through practices and debates about these practices, moves us closer to an understanding of the contingent nature of a political system we've come to treat as a gold standard. So my subject is a common and crucial question revolutionaries faced on both sides of the Atlantic, which was determining the place of secrecy in new governments that staked their legitimacy on claiming to speak for the people. Deciding who could see what in the political process was tantamount to determining what it meant to represent the people in government. And revolutionaries knew this at the time. Those advocating more publicity, or transparency as we would call it today, did so as part of an effort to define political representation as an ongoing reflection of the public's wishes, while those who theorized utility for secrecy saw it as a tool to protect officials from undue pressure in determining the best interest of the nation as a whole. Though the questions revolutionaries faced were common, their answers were definitely not. American politicians used secrecy strategically to legitimize political representation as a process whereby elected leaders were to determine the best interests of the population without facing ongoing pressure in the process. Although French politicians had a similar vision for how political representation ought to work, they were dedicated to performing the political process in full public view. This allowed for the persistence of an alternate understanding of the representative process as one of dialogue between elected officials and the people, whereby public opinion was to be constantly reflected in political decision-making. The result of these divergent decisions, I think, is profound. It was profound. Secrecy proved a primary axis upon which the meaning and legitimacy of representative government was negotiated in the French and American revolutions. So to get at how and why, let's now jump back finally to 1789, specifically to a rainy day in lower Manhattan. So on the afternoon of April 30th, George Washington took the first presidential oath of office on the balcony of the newly renovated Federal Hall, which you can see here, in front of throngs of curious onlookers. Afterward, he withdrew, along with members of Congress, into the Senate chamber, where the doors were shut to the public. There, he delivered a brief address before making his way through parades back to his house for a private dinner. Now, I open with this scene just to give you a sense of the spaces where politics were actually happening at the dawn of the American Republic. And what I want to point out is that there were both public and private aspects of this process. So moments where regular people could watch their elected leaders perform rituals, like you see here, and others when officials deliberated away from the eyes of their constituents. And What I want to suggest is that there was nothing natural about the way that these lines between transparent and secret, visible and concealed were actually drawn. So deciding who should see what was actually a real dilemma for elected officials in 1789. And what I want to emphasize is that their answers to this question were significantly shaped by their understandings of what it meant for politics to be representative. And perhaps more importantly than this, their decisions about this had big implications for how political representation actually worked in practice. Examining how the place of secrecy in politics was debated and worked out highlights the extent to which the meaning of political representation was very unsettled as Americans embarked on their grand Republican experiment. It simply wasn't clear whether representing the people meant being elected by them and then determining their best interest without their input, or whether it required adhering to public opinion throughout the political decision-making process. And in taking up the task of exploring how political theories were negotiated in practice, I should say that I'm building on a profusion of scholarship on early American political culture that explores how ideas translated into institutions. So in 1969, Gordon Wood argued that, according to the framers, the legitimacy of representatives was to be affirmed in the moment of election. So essentially, sovereignty of the people meant that government was derived from their consent, but then carried out in the hands of an elite. And this was, by Wood's estimation, the unique invention of the American Revolution. So he thought by concentrating legitimacy in the act of voting, the framers had essentially solved the paradox of how political representation could be a stable tool of popular sovereignty. But the problem is that Wood didn't really proceed to explain how, why, or even whether this solution actually worked in practice. And ever since, a lot of scholarship on the early national period has been essentially aimed at explaining how the new federal government was made legitimate. So my work is aimed precisely at this problem. And I want to suggest that a major part of the answer is that the use of secrecy in the new government was actually central to legitimating a particular vision of representative politics as directive of the national interest rather than reflective of public opinion. So when Congress convened in New York City during the spring of 1789, the question of whether its activity would be publicly visible remained unresolved. So the Constitution required a periodic publication of congressional journals, quote, excepting such parts as in their judgment may require secrecy, which you can see up here. But it did not detail how often they should publish these journals or give any criteria for what could properly be withheld from them. And the way in which secrecy could be used by the executive branch remained even more of an open question because there was really no direction at all in the Constitution about this. But the lack of clarity didn't mean there were a lack of constraints when it came to making decisions about secrecy. So the topic and its place in a representative government, secrecy, had been a really hot-button issue during the ratification debates, which had begun in 1787 and were actually still ongoing at this point when the government started in Rhode Island. So to understand how people were thinking about secrecy and political representation as the government was set up, I'm going to dip into these debates to give you a sense of the stakes of this. So as many of you may know, though I don't think it's commonly discussed, the convention where the framers convened over the summer of 1787 to actually draft the Constitution was held behind closed doors and under oath of secrecy. So here you can see the depiction of the representatives or the delegates to the Constitutional Convention meeting, which you'll note shows basically a small number of men inside a very cramped room. So like many deliberative bodies of its time, including many of the state legislatures and officially also the Parliament in England, its debates were conducted in secret without public audience. Many of the delegates wrote letters over that summer apologizing to their correspondents for being unable to convey any details of the meetings and explaining why they felt the measures for secrecy were beneficial to the deliberative process. The public needed to be protected from misrepresentations, they said. And the delegates also had to be protected from popular pressure in order to conduct what they often called unbiased debate. So in articulating the reasons for meeting in secret, delegates elaborated a particular vision of what it meant to represent the people. After having been elected to go there and deliberate on their behalf, deputies were supposed to independently determine the best interest of the people without facing too much ongoing popular pressure. And secrecy was really vital to enacting this vision of representative politics. After voting for representatives, delegates in this case, the people had no need to see what they were actually doing as they deliberated because the public had no role in the decision-making process. As Washington put it in a letter to James Madison shortly after the convention disbanded in October, quote, "Not everyone has opportunities to peep behind the curtain. The multitude often judge from externals." So he didn't specify whether he thought this was good or bad, only that he thought it was useful to create distance between elected officials and their constituents in order to craft public perceptions of politics. It was only by voting that the people would once again exercise their sovereignty by either affirming or rejecting their representatives or the product they were presented with in this case. So this was not an understanding of representative politics that everyone shared. Over the course of the next 2 years, the question of whether and when secrecy was acceptable in the new government was central to the debates over the new federal framework and what would make political representation legitimate in this new system. So opponents of the Constitution, often called anti-federalists, pointed to the concealment of the convention's deliberations and provisions in the Constitution allowing for secrecy, firstly as evidence of the delegates' conspiratorial designs. Secondly, they cited the use of secrecy as a reason to challenge the legitimacy of the convention and of the government that it proposed on the basis that representative politics must be carried out visibly in order to be considered legitimate. But proponents of the Constitution, known as Federalists, they didn't recant in the face of these kind of criticisms. Many mounted a defense of the convention's commitment to secrecy, in this case meaning closed door and unpublished deliberations, and its utility to the new federal government, arguing that secrecy was useful and even necessary to avoid compromised proceedings. So the debates over the propriety of deliberating in secret mapped directly onto underlying disagreements between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists about how political representation should work and what was going to make it legitimate. So because I don't have time to dig into the many, many examples of these competing lines of thinking through the ratification debates, I'm just going to cite 2 newspaper pieces to give you a sense of the stakes of this debate about secrecy and how it reflected competing understandings of political representation. So the first example is a piece printed in the New York Journal on November 24th, 1787 by an anonymous anti-federalist who conveyed an understanding of political representation very much at odds with the idea the framers had sort of adopted and practiced. His vision of representative politics required delegates to interact with their constituents throughout the deliberative process. The fact that the delegates to the Constitutional Convention had sealed themselves off from the wider world as they framed the Constitution, he believed, rendered the document in need of the people's assent, which it was being presented for at the time, in order to be recognized as a plan that was actually made in their name, as it claimed to be. So here he is in his own words. This imperfect representation of the people, both as to numbers and descriptions, when assembled, shut their doors against their fellow citizens and laid themselves under obligations of secrecy. And by keeping from the world a knowledge of their important business, which they had assumed upon themselves, they were precluded from all opportunities of receiving light or information upon so interesting a subject from the animadversions of their constituents would probably have made upon the different points under their deliberation. Under these unfavorable circumstances, this new constitution was formed, and it must therefore be considered as an unauthorized essay, which can only receive sanction from the assent of the people. So his characterization of why the convention was illegitimate as a representative institution that could do something in the name of the people itself was very much in large part due to its shutting their doors, to the delegates' obligations of secrecy, and to them keeping from the world a knowledge of their deliberations. And more importantly, what he thought all of these measures did is prevent delegates from receiving lighter information from their constituents, which the author argued would have been necessary for the deliberative process to be sort of publicly sanctioned. So almost a month later, in the Poughkeepsie Country Journal, an anonymous country federalist attempted to deprive these types of critiques of secrecy by asserting the utility of it to protecting the integrity of the deliberative process. So he said, quote, "From the circumstance that the convention conducted their deliberations in private for the purpose of more free and liberal discussion, critics assert that it originated in the absolute conspiracy of a set of false, detestable patriots, for these are their epithets, to erect a despotic government over this country." Closing the doors was a cautionary measure, the way that he saw it, to allow for more free and liberal discussion, as he said. Not evidence of conspiratorial intentions or an effort to undermine political representation or the will of the people. Those who argue that the doors should have been open, quote, "appeal with a winning address to the most powerful passions of the heart," the Federalists argued. And in so doing, they attempted to prejudice the public view of the Constitution based on insinuations that the circumstances under which it was developed were questionable. So by the time members of the new federal government made their way to the temporary capital in New York City, a little over a year after these pieces were printed, the Constitution was ratified, but the question of what could be kept secret and what needed to be done publicly in the political process remained very much unsettled. The decisions politicians made and the debates that those spurred were constitutive of these competing understandings of what it meant to represent the people, a disagreement which persisted into the establishment of the early republic. So in either contesting closed doors or carving out space for private political debate, early American citizens and politicians were very much negotiating the very legitimacy of the representative republic. Seemingly simple procedural questions about public visibility in the political process actually carried really big implications for how this unfolded and the nature of the new regime. So before moving across the Atlantic, I just want to give you a brief sense of how this unfolded in Congress, which I'll focus on here to the exclusion of the executive just for the sake of time. So in the newly created Congress, the balance of secrecy and publicity was mostly discussed in terms of public access to the room where they held their deliberations. So especially for printers who came to try to publish records of their debates. So on April 8th, the House of Representatives opened its doors the first day it's met, allowed reporters inside, and had an audience. And here, actually, I just want to show you some of the shorthand notes of one of the first congressional reporters, just to give you a sense of what rendering the political process transparent actually looked like in the 18th century before recording devices or any sort of technology. As you can maybe not see because it's not very clear since we're a microfilm, but this is all done in a shorthand that this person developed himself, which only was decoded in the 1950s. So it's very complex. You can see he has little, this is the pointer, he has a little doodle here of someone. But basically, these are the notes of Thomas Lloyd. And you can see that it's pretty messy, and so maybe it's not surprising that it produced a lot of errors, and it angered a lot of politicians. But a number of printers took up this endeavor, and they really portrayed it as something that they saw as a crucial civic function in a representative republic. So while the House tolerated this kind of reporting, the Senate didn't. It closed its doors right across the hall. Historians have often stated as fact that the House was open because it was sort of the more directly democratic wing of the legislature, while the Senate remained shut off from public view because it was, in theory, supposed to represent the states. In reality, these decisions were neither obvious nor inevitable at all. The House's determination about what would be carried out in public view and the Senate's commitment to closed doors were deliberate and contested actions that reflected these underlying understandings of what they were doing in representing the people. So the commentary of constituents, printers, and regular spectators who attended the House debates reveals a real hunger for publicity of the political process as a crucial component of political representation in the sense that anti-federalists had articulated, which is to say of reflecting the public's wishes and input throughout the political decision-making process. So writing to Massachusetts Representative George Thatcher to establish a regular correspondence, for example, a Boston printer named Thomas Waite explained his reason for wanting reports, stating that, quote, "should you but once convince me of your insensibility to the censure or applause of your constituents, I should from necessity at the time acknowledge a conviction that you was a very dangerous person to be employed in their service." the publicity of their proceedings was what would give the population power to ensure that their representatives stuck to their wishes. Those who criticized the Senate for closing its doors and deliberating in secret also emphasized the centrality of public visibility to the legitimacy of the representative process. So writing to James Madison in late May of '89, noted Virginia anti-federalist Joseph Jones asked why the doors to the Senate were shut while those to the House were open, when, quote, "it appears to be equally proper and necessary for the information and satisfaction of the people that their conduct and proceedings in the character I have mentioned should be as public and well known as that of the other House." Advocates of more publicity in the political process, then, did not really tend to distinguish between the House and the Senate, seeing them as equally representative bodies, which by many people's measures necessitated that they perform their work in public view. But a wish to avoid the kind of relationship between the elected and their constituents that these demands for publicity rested upon led members of the House even to carve out space for conducting politics in private and drove senators to articulate a defense of their chamber's use of secrecy. So though representatives profess their commitment to publishing their proceedings, in their correspondence, they're constantly calling for confidentiality. So typically toward the end of letters that members would send back home, they would note that they expected the contents to be held in, quote, "the utmost confidence," or that what they had written was, quote, "confidential and not to be made public." And also delineating physical space for the political process to unfold outside the eyes of the public began in 1789. So we know, partly from the complaints of elected officials like Pennsylvania Senator William Maclay, that no small amount of business was actually carried out at dinners or in taverns or at social gatherings held at the president's house. There were also committees created, which would meet in the mornings before the House convened as a whole body, and there's no evidence that the public or printers were allowed to attend these. Moreover, already in the summer of 1789, there were certain topics that came up for debate in the House where it did shut its doors or restricted the circulation of information. So from the beginning, negotiations over the location of the federal government and the related debt assumption discussions were conducted in hushed tones. Pennsylvania Representative Peter Muhlenberg reported to a correspondent that the discussions about the Capitol, quote, "which are not publicly transacted and will not appear in the papers, are most agitated, although in private." So even the introduction of the Bill of Rights in the summer of 1789, which is really Madison's effort to solidify loyalty to the Constitution, was apparently kept very, very quiet at first. So though members of the House of Representatives were often a bit furtive, despite their avowed dedication to ensuring the publicity of their proceedings, most senators really propagated no such illusions. So the Senate was a secret place, and it would actually remain so until it opened its doors under a lot of pressure in 1795. So for some senators, debating out of the public's view was essential to maintaining the people's confidence in any representative body. Payne Wingate, a senator from New Hampshire, explained his thinking in a letter to well-known Massachusetts Federalist Timothy Pickering at the end of April, stating simply, quote, "I do not desire that the private conduct or public proceedings of this body should be exposed to the daily inspection of the populace. Deliberating a little more out of public view would conduce to its respectability in the opinion of the country, who would then judge of that body by its public acts and doings." So this reasoning resonated strongly with the Federalist uses of secrecy and statements about its utility to representative politics during the framing of the Constitution. Representative government required a public presentation of legislative products, but was actually strengthened by hiding the processes of reaching these products. So by the end of 1789 in the US, we have a bicameral legislature where one chamber allowed a public audience and printed accounts of its proceedings as sort of an apparent acknowledgement of the popular pressure that was really there to publicize deliberations in order to ensure the legitimacy of political representation. Yet we see the other chamber meeting in secret, and many members of both houses actually asserting that representative politics actually required a degree of secrecy in order to create the distance necessary between elected officials and their constituents so that they could actually deliberate without facing undue pressure. And while I didn't really get into it today because I don't have time, the Washington administration also established a precedent of using secrecy as a tool to also advance this vision of federalist sort of representative government. Now, despite mounting calls for greater publicity of the political process, American politicians in 1789 actually used secrecy to assert a very particular vision of representative politics that would prove able to maintain stability at times when public opinion didn't seem to really align with government decisions, which was going to be a lot in the 1790s. So as the government found its footing in the US, across the Atlantic, deputies to the first Estates General to convene in 175 years made their way to Versailles for the opening of deliberations on the kingdom's fiscal and constitutional crises, which you can see a depiction of here, a celebratory depiction. So, defining themselves in opposition to a monarchy that clung to practices of secret political decision-making, even in its last throes, the deputies of the Third Estate, what would become sort of the Commons, in particular, proclaimed the value of publicity to the political process. Unlike their American counterparts, they did not articulate a theory of secrecy's utility to representative government. Adhering to transparent decision-making was at the very heart of what was to make them legitimate representatives of the people. Secrecy simply had no place in a representative regime. And this wasn't just rhetoric they were using. Members of the Estates General, which transformed into the National Assembly as it claimed sovereign power in June of 1789, established procedures guaranteeing open meeting chambers, designed systems to print, distribute, and even translate their decrees, maintained access for journalists and the ability for them to print records of legislative debates, and set up a process whereby petitioners could actually come and just speak to them directly during their meetings. The implications of this multifaceted commitment to publicité, to use the French term, were paradoxical. So though it was championed and implemented as a means to attain legitimacy, publicizing its proceedings actually ended up undermining the representative government more than bolstering it. So outside the halls of government, the notion of publicity collided with this vigorous sort of culture of vigilance and was taken up by radical journalists and club activists as a mechanism whereby elected officials could be sort of held accountable for their every action, their every decision. Daily independent reports of what happened inside the National Assembly allowed for constant commentary on every aspect of governance, which in turn heightened tension when the deputies and the people didn't really seem to agree, which again happened a lot in the 1790s. So journalists and polemicists made it their task to hold representatives accountable by exposing their operations to the public and purporting to reflect the public's opinion back to the deputies. And visibility fed this vigilance and helped to engender an active political culture that kind of blurred distinctions between the government and the population for whom it spoke. So in the time I have left, I'll take you through the summer of 1789 in France, just to explain why the deputies of the National Assembly committed so wholeheartedly to performing their work in public view, and why it posed problems for the legitimacy of the regime they aimed to found. So first I'll give you just a brief overview of the mounting pressure for publicité in the political process as the delegates convened in Versailles. And then I'll explain how the deputies' commitment to deliberating in public view became increasingly incompatible with the type of political representation that they were actually theorizing, which was really quite similar to how the American framers, the Federalists, were envisioning it in the United States. And then finally, I'll show how this commitment to acting visibly fused with this popular notion of vigilance and really created instability for the government. So once again, secrecy proved to be a central axis upon which the meaning and legitimacy of political representation was negotiated. But unlike in the US, it was by disavowing it rather than adopting it that revolutionaries really shaped their regime. So even before the deputies made their way to Versailles, publicizing the deliberative process was beginning to be considered a crucial component of representative politics. Throughout the latter half of 1788 and into 89, tons of pamphlets and tracts were published proclaiming not just the importance of a free press, but of freeing the press in order to make politics specifically more transparent. So partly this was building upon an Enlightenment sort of trend of criticizing the monarchy for its dependence on secrecy and associating this with despotism. But it was also part of a new attempt to re-envision politics as representative. So communication of events in the assembly and opinions about them was considered crucial by many sort of aspiring journalists, and by some appraisals not to be halted. So one of these aspiring journalists actually prefaced his request to publish. He wrote to the old regime's censorship administration, which they required to get a permission to publish something. And he submitted this request, and he said, quote, "It will be difficult for any human power to stop the communication of news from the Estates General, such that it will be perhaps be dangerous to constrain it." So though entrepreneurs like this one did have monetary motivations, right, for advocating the value of publicity to the Estates General, they were also building upon this long-held conviction in the need to loosen censorship in France and to render politics more transparent. And they were sort of responding to this massive hunger for news from this huge event that everyone, not only in France, but in Europe, was very interested in. But the royal administration would really not heed his warning at all. Instead, they denied all requests to publish accounts of the meetings in Versailles. The sanctioning of such publications was considered inadvisable at best and downright dangerous at worst. Le Patriote François, which you can see here, a newspaper run by Jacques-Pierre Brissot de Warville, was one among a number that appeared that spring without having sought permission, and despite the royal administration's efforts to stop them. So confident that a declaration of press freedom was imminent, and that chronicles of the National Assembly just couldn't wait, Brissot went ahead and launched his periodical as he planned on May 6th. Asserting that freely printed gazettes had assured the success of the American Revolution, Brissot went on to lay out the goals of his periodic chronicle, chief among which was the accurate reporting of all issues having to do with the Estates General. So he proclaimed that, quote, "This precious publicity will be the only way to make known to the nation its defenders and stop betrayal by its enemies." So a number of deputies also established periodicals dedicated to publishing their proceedings and sort of vaunting the importance of publicité to representative politics. Publicizing the deliberative process via the reporting of periodicals specifically was then established even before the National Assembly was as sort of a crucial component of its legitimacy. So as the Third Estate gradually claimed authority as the nation's sovereign legislature, maintaining an open meeting chamber and access for journalists, open lines of communication with constituents were really central to the deputies' efforts to establish themselves as representatives. Not only did deputies allow reporters to chronicle their proceedings and defy royal bans on printing their own, the meetings of the Third Estate, which took place in the Salle des Menus Plaisirs in Versailles, were open to the public from the beginning. So estimates put the average number of non-deputies in the room at anywhere between 2,000 on an average day and 4,000 for the opening of the estates. Just think about that number. I mean, it's really massive. And to give a sense of the magnitude, actually, there were about 1,200 elected deputies. So even the meeting itself is really massive, much bigger than the Congress in the US. And here, actually, I just want to give you a sense of how this kind of contrasts with the Constitutional Convention that we looked at earlier in the US, which was in the small, cramped room. Some guys, here you have a depiction of the Estates General. And you can see there are women on the floor of the estate talking to them. And up here, you can see these kind of masses of people that are portrayed in these balconies looking down. So it's a big contrast. So from the beginning in France, the deputies were really committed to acting visibly. In response to a suggestion in late May that members of the public be removed from the Assembly Hall, Third Estate Deputy Constantin François de Chassebeuf de Volney captured the mood of many, declaring, quote, "I cannot respect he who seeks to hide himself in the shadows. The fullness of day is made to shed light on the truth, and I am proud to think like the philosopher who said that all his actions never had anything secret, and he wished that his house was made of glass." But this idea that deputies should work in a house of glass, that secrecy was anathema to representative government, was being articulated as understandings of what it meant to be representative were actually evolving. So With the convening of the Estates General, there were kind of two strands of thought about what it meant to be representative that were kind of jostling for primacy. So one held that deputies were strictly beholden to the specific will of their constituents through binding mandates, that they literally sort of met and incarnated the people in this process. The other view called for deputies to represent the will of a nation as a whole, giving the deputies themselves the right to speak for the nation without having to literally consult it in any concrete way. But when they discarded their binding mandates that they'd come with and declared themselves the sovereign representatives of the nation on June 17th, the deputies chose this latter conception of representation, which, as historian Paul Friedland has argued, relegated the people to a role as, quote, political spectators, with no direct say in the formation of the nation's will. But despite defining political representation as this kind of abstract concept where the people's will would be decided at a distance rather than directly reflected, much like American Federalists had done, as a reminder, unlike their American counterparts, most deputies maintained a belief that the process of determining this will should be sort of performed publicly nonetheless. Throughout the repeated relocations that were necessitated by the king closing the chamber numerous times over the summer, the presence of crowds as they deliberated was always guaranteed. When Louis XVI stationed troops around the assembly hall and ordered them to stop the public from entering the chambers in late June, the deputies responded with a resounding commitment to open their doors. Not only did they immediately establish a national printer to print their decrees, on June 25th, they resolved to convey to the king their objections to having soldiers around the hall and barring public entry. In his memoirs, Third Estate Deputy and soon-to-be mayor of Paris, Jean-Sylvain Bailly, noted that the admission of, quote, strangers, which is what they called unelected people in the 18th century in the chamber, strangers in the meetings had been a nagging concern for the royal ministers, who had actually voiced this to him repeatedly prior to the king's ban. He replied that he was aware of both the advantages and the inconveniences of letting the public attend their deliberations, but, quote, we were in a time when no advantage could be neglected, nor outweighed by inconveniences. Moreover, it was impossible to prevent this publicity, he said. When the ministers suggested the implementation of a ticketing system to let in only select people, Bailly reported that he balked, arguing that as the nation's proxies is sort of the term that he used, they did not have the power to hide themselves. Quote, the free opening of the doors was an indispensable obligation, he wrote, essential to the political representation as a process of reflecting the will of constituents and carrying out their wishes. But the reality was that the deputies had really rejected this understanding of their role in declaring themselves the National Assembly, despite their continued adherence to publicity. Throughout the summer, and once they relocated to Paris in October of 1789, the National Assembly continued to profess a commitment to publicité, though its meaning was increasingly sort of confused and contested as it was actually put into practice. To many of those with their eyes fixed on the assembly, publicity meant more than having information sort of passively delivered to them. A sense of visibility as vigilance, as expressed earlier by someone like Brousseau, permeated popular understandings of what it meant to render government transparent. At stake in defining publicity, why it was important and how it would be enacted was, again, the very meaning of representative politics. The question of whether to open doors to deliberations, if and how to regulate the press, and what work to keep secret were informed by underlying disagreements about how political representation was supposed to and was going to work. To those who pushed for the enactment of publicity through unfettered access to and reporting on the National Assembly's deliberative process, vigilance was a central component of ensuring that representatives adhered to the desires of the population they were meant to reflect. However, many deputies were beginning to see a real need to control the flow of information and limit publicity if they were going to enact political representation as they had actually conceived of it in June. Which is to say, as a group of enlightened men, sort of deliberating at a distance from the people to form the will of the nation as a whole. So increasingly, deputies made efforts to control the attendance of the public and reporters at assembly meetings and set up committees that met outside of public view. But these measures were really met with a lot of suspicion after the wholehearted commitment to transparency from the beginning. So when the Assembly did move to Paris that fall, delegates found themselves at the epicenter of this culture of vigilance that had been kind of percolating throughout the summer. Vigilance was the raison d'être of many of the political clubs that formed over the summer and fall of 1789, from the Cordelier Club to the Société des Amis de la Constitution, which would come to be known as the Jacobin Club. Not only were these groups on the lookout for counter-revolutionary plots and threats and tricks by the royal regime, they were also explicitly dedicated to watching their representatives. So the Cordelier, whose logo you can see here is kind of this ominous eye staring at you, repeatedly cited the belief that, quote, publicité is the safeguard of the people. And they noted their dedication to, quote, an indefatigable vigilance. And the Assembly's presence in Paris proved a real boon to journalists who were often kind of connected to these types of clubs and who made it their mission to chronicle the deputies' actions, especially those journalists whose stated purpose was to hold the nation's representatives accountable to public opinion. In line with the many periodicals proposed in the spring of '89 that we talked about earlier, newspapers launched during the summer and fall continued to proclaim the centrality of this publicity through the press to the representative process. So the deputies' commitment to publicité, a term that had fluid meaning and left room for many kind of interpretations, facilitated the persistence of a theory of representative politics that the deputies had kind of rejected in June of '89. In the process of transforming from a body of corporate estates that came carrying these binding mandates into a sovereign legislature speaking on behalf of the French people as a whole, the deputies necessarily and fundamentally reimagined what it meant to represent the people. Led by the Abbé Sieyès, they articulated that June a conception of political representation wherein elected officials were to determine the will of the nation while insulated from this popular pressure. They discarded their binding mandates, insisting that each delegate spoke for the interest of the nation as a whole rather than any particular constituency. But by committing to publicité, the separation between the people and their representatives that would have been required for this new theory of political representation to work at all was functionally diminished. Welcoming and encouraging a constant public audience led the unelected to watch vigilantly, believing that they too were part of the political decision-making process. Though the radical insistence on vigilance and the constant surveillance of elected officials was a rhetoric that sometimes carried violent undertones and would develop into violent action, it was also a logical outgrowth of the deputies' emphatic commitment to acting visibly. Parisian radicals tapped into a common conception of the utility of publicity to political representation, which inherently created an opening whereby the unelected could assert an active role in politics, and which, for this reason, rapidly posed problems for the stability of the regime. So why did the deputies disavow secrecy as they formed a representative government? I think the answer isn't too hard to determine, really. Their commitment to publicity, to transparent governance, was really necessary to gain public trust in the context of old regime political culture. Even before they convened in Versailles, like we saw, pamphleteers, aspiring journalists, and some deputies themselves were linking the value of publicity to the validity of the representative process that was going to take place. The deputies' new theory of political representation thus immediately collided with this strong current of sort of Enlightenment thinking about the use of secrecy and the value of publicity in government. State secrecy was not only politically untenable at this point, it was kind of intellectually moribund by 1789. It was just really disavowed. Yet many deputies gradually began seeing it as something that was valuable, if not necessary, to actually implement a new type of representative politics that would gain stability. A contest over the meaning of publicity and its practical function in politics thus ensued, as deputies and their constituents attempted to work out representative politics in practice. So now that I've taken you on this kind of whirlwind tour through the founding of representative regimes in France and the United States, I'll just conclude with 3 points that I'd really like you to take away from my talk. First, revolutionaries in the United States and France attempted in the late 1780s to establish representative government as a tool of popular sovereignty. On both sides of the Atlantic, leaders articulated a vision of political representation wherein elected officials were made legitimate by being elected, but were then supposed to determine the best interest of the population without ongoing pressure of public opinion or popular input. Second, the use of secrecy in the political process was a crucial tool for enacting this type of political representation in practice. Secrecy was deployed by American politicians, particularly Federalists, to create a distinction between representatives and their constituents that really contributed to the stabilizing of new governments and legitimating this vision of representative politics. Yet advocates of greater political publicity, transparency, continued to advance a competing vision of political representation as a process that required ongoing dialogue between elected officials and their constituents in order to ensure that government decisions reflected the will of the people. And third, in France, politicians adhered to this conviction that transparency was a crucial component of representative politics, even as they attempted to reject the type of process that it entailed. Publicity of the political process allowed the unelected to challenge the legitimacy of the representative regime in situations where elected representatives and the people did not really seem to agree on what was right. So as a historian, I'm not in the business of making predictions or prescriptions, but historical precedent for current debates about the proper place of secrecy in representative democracies, I think, needs to be considered. Today, as in the 18th century, our attitudes on this issue, I think, often come down to partisan assessments of who we think is right and of whether we think the majority agrees with us or not. But we would do well to be aware of the stakes of our positions on secrecy in government. Over time, decisions about what is and is not done in public view and what the public can and cannot know can have a really lasting impact on the nature of representative democracy. Moreover, my research suggests that the crucial importance of procedural decisions in moments of revolutionary transition, especially to democratic regimes. Though we tend to associate democracy with transparency, studying the founding of representative governments in the 18th century suggests the potential importance of a degree of secrecy in the initial phases of state formation. Thanks.
Hey, we have time for some questions. So if you raise your hand and wait for one of us with mics to come around, we'll let Dr. Carter handle our own questions.
Thanks, Caitlin, for a really good talk. I really, it's always great to think about, to remember what's going on for me, remember what's going on in the United States in 1789, and to think about these two things together. My question is, I think you're really persuasive about the French case and about why it was politically and philosophically untenable to make a case for secrecy in light of the deep critique of the monarchy on precisely those grounds.
Right.
And Necker's compte rendu and comes to mind as kind of what started that off.
Yeah.
But I wonder if on the other side there isn't also some context that has to do with the British Parliament. And here I'm thinking, I don't know how important this was in the US, but there was certainly, in France, there was a critique of the kind of hurly-burly nature of the British Parliament and how this is, I think Montesquieu makes this critique, and that continues, and the desire to not have it, that it was out of control, really, and to try to come up with a system. And I'm wondering if the Americans were conscious of that and thinking about what they were going to do in relation to a critique, perhaps, of the British Parliament.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question of bringing the British into this story, because they are really important, because they're kind of a point of reference for both the French and the Americans. They're comparing themselves to what's going on in Britain. And there had actually been a lot of debates in the 1770s about specifically the House of Commons and trying to open up the House of Commons and let reporters actually come in and report on their debates and let them have a public audience. And that essentially happened. Members of parliament tried to fight that really hard, but they were unsuccessful. So even though the rule that it was technically secret stayed on the books into the 19th century, it really wasn't enforced very much anymore from the 1770s. But this notion that it was like out of control and really rowdy, certainly that was in the US as well. People thought that. But I think what people in the US, when they thought about parliament, or not in the US, really in the colonies, then in the US, when they thought about parliament, were more thinking, I think, about kind of John Wilkes and this attempt to open parliament. They also saw parliament, and especially the House of Commons, as this kind of space where the ministry was corrupting representation because it wasn't transparent enough, and that actually, the ministries were kind of secretly pulling strings. So there's that kind of vein in this anti-federalist critique of secrecy. In terms of people who are advocating the use of secrecy for the deliberative process, they're really looking more at the state legislatures that had been formed with the Declaration of Independence in the 1770s. So a lot of, James Madison is sort of chief among these people who come to Philadelphia really concerned that the state legislatures are just out of control, that it's way too democratic, and they're passing really unwise legislation due to a lot of popular pressure, specifically in regard to taxes and printing paper money. So they're really concerned that these state legislatures, some of them were open to the public. They're really concerned that those aren't functioning very well. So I think that they're more looking at that and saying, okay, we've tried this and it's not going very well. So then they think about shutting things down.
So I'll take microphone prerogative and ask you a question about how quickly these lines developed along partisan lines. So once ratification is done, are there sort of clear partisan positions in terms of for or against more secrecy, or does it devolve pretty quickly into whoever's the incumbent wants more secrecy and whoever's in the opposition wants more openness?
Yeah, this is a great question. And actually, I think it's through the ratification debates themselves that this becomes partisan. So when we're talking about during the Constitutional Convention, actually a lot of the deputies across what would become factional lines are sort of behind the secrecy rule. They're sort of, in general, those who say anything about it tend to be pretty supportive of it. And it's only when the ratification debates happen that this issue becomes politicized and it becomes tied to these kind of competing understandings of what they're building. And in the early republic, it stays politicized, and it is a partisan issue. Though I think that there's certainly some instances of people changing their minds, like once they get into power versus when they were not. So like James Madison is actually an example of this, though he goes the opposite way. He had been in favor of secrecy. Then he's in the House of Representatives in the early republic, and he thinks that there's a lot of really unpopular legislation being passed and that the Washington administration is doing a lot of things that are not popular. And he kind of, to his kind of credit, or it makes him really interesting, he really changes his mind about how this should work, and he becomes much more in favor of more publicity. So it's not always like a hypocritical or sort of strategic decision based on whether you're in office or not, but it does tend to stay partisan along the lines of sort of more conservative, for lack of a better term, and sort of people who are wanting more popular involvement in government.
Yeah, thank you for a really wonderful talk.
Thanks.
It occurs to me that this is taking place in the context of what military historians have called the Second 100 Years' War.
Yeah.
And given discussions about secrecy in wartime, generally not a good idea to tell people what your main objective, or tell your enemy publicly what your main objectives are, how pissed off your soldiers are, they're not getting their back pay, their levels of morale, how cold it is, so on and so forth. I wonder what the context of warfare, especially in the 1790s and impending warfare in the War of 1812, did to discussions about openness and publicity, and what that can tell us about the shift towards the Comité de Salut Public on the one hand. And I'm very unfamiliar with the American context, so maybe you could talk a little bit about that. That'd be phenomenal.
Yeah, thank you for that question and bringing up war and sort of the role of war in deciding these things. So part of what I look at is sort of how secrecy, which becomes really questioned in this kind of pre-revolutionary period, how it becomes made legitimate again under these new regimes. And the case really is that it comes to be made legitimate. It's always considered legitimate in military contexts, right? And that becomes a zone where people say, okay, well, it's allowed in this context. And an interesting way of looking at that is sort of, if you look at the American War for Independence, which is being fought in the late 70s and the 80s, the Continental Congress meets absolutely in secrecy. They keep secret journals, and then they keep even more secret journals in case those aren't secret enough. And they justify this for military reasons and for diplomatic reasons. And mostly people are kind of on board with that. The place where that changes is kind of in the early republic. There's this effort as the Washington administration decides to maintain neutrality, for example, in the British and French conflict. There is a push for diplomacy to even be conducted more openly, because people say, well, we don't want that. We want to side with the French. And you're deciding this in secret because you know we don't agree. So even that gets pushed a little bit. But in general, if there is, I've found at least that if there is an active military conflict, especially on the soil where the government is operating, there very much is an adherence to secrecy. And like you mentioned in France, the implementation of the Committee of Public Safety, which meets in secret, one of their main reasons for justifying that is we're at war with enemies inside the country and on our borders. So we have to meet in secret in order to be effective and move quickly.
Thank you. That was a fantastic talk. I learned a lot. I have two questions that you sort of touched on, but I'd like you to say more. I could push you a little bit on. One was about transparency and in relationship to accountability. I wanted to hear a little bit more about the different models of conceptualizations of accountability and how it works.
Yeah.
It seems like they're operating not just on different conceptualizations of representations or understandings of representation, but also accountability, and the role of the election specifically in holding representatives accountable. And the other was about the ancien regime and how much that matters in terms of these kinds of preference and preference formation. You touched on it again, but I'd like to hear a little bit more. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. In terms of accountability, I think that's actually a great question because what you see is, especially if you look at France, for example, before the revolution, you see a lot of calls for more publicity in the royal government, also linked to the notion of accountability. So basically, there's this argument that develops that we need the royal administration to be much more accountable to the population than it is. And one of the solutions to this would be if they worked more transparently and did away with so much secrecy in everything. And I think that that is a fundamentally different idea of accountability than this idea of representative accountability, which is this notion that we sent you there to speak for us and you're doing things on our behalf. And that entails a different type of accountability. So that means like you need to be accountable to my opinion and what I want you to do. Whereas when they're talking about it under like the royal regime, it's more about preventing abuses of power and sort of answering to general sort of more broad claims of like rights or meeting basic standards. So I think that's a key shift that I'm trying to trace is sort of how the very idea of accountability changes when the government is purportedly made legitimate by saying, speaking on behalf of the people and doing what they want. It adds another level to that. And then in terms of the Ancien Régime and sort of its role in this, I think it's absolutely critical. And it's a huge difference between the French context and the American context, where the French at the beginning are still operating with this king in power and in the same place as them. And this issue of secrecy had become really central to the critique of the monarchy, and which was very mistrusted. And in the US, you don't have that, you don't have the immediacy of that. I mean, the king is done away with very early. They're like, we're not gonna have him in our system anymore. And he's across the Atlantic Ocean. So it's a really different dynamic. So I think that they're able to use secrecy. It's not so discredited, basically, because they're not trying to establish their legitimacy sort of in that context and in distinction to this figure that persists to be there and to, advance and adhere to secrecy. Yeah.
I wonder whether there was more accountability in the process of ratifying the Constitution within the states, and whether the people, the constituency, had more access to the decision-making process there, and in a broader context, whether there is a trickle-down effect in secrecy, whether it's into state governments, into county and township, and especially city governments, even though the people in power there are closer to their constituencies, they still can practice secrecy, certainly.
Absolutely. And bringing up ratification, thank you for bringing that up. So in some senses, the instance of the Constitutional Convention is a peculiar one in that the deputies who went there were not elected directly by the people. They're sent by state legislatures to go there. And what they do, of course, they do something they really weren't authorized to do. And they know that, and that's also part of why they're adhering to secrecy. And then what they do is they present the Constitution for ratification. So they do let people come and debate it and decide whether they want to accept it or not. And the ratification conventions in the states, most of them were very open, actually, and talked about the need to open their doors to kind of prevent these accusations of not being legitimate as voices of people. So in that case, they were. But it was still, Anti-Federalists were still angry about this because they felt like that wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to be presented with the product and then just say yes or no, because they didn't allow them to offer amendments. And they thought, that's actually not enough. We can't just be presented with this and say yes or no. We need to have a window into how this was all negotiated and how you came to these conclusions, and we should have been part of the process of doing that. So I would say yes, in ratification, the people did have a more sort of active role in assenting to the Constitution, but there were still people who thought that wasn't sufficient for it to be a document sort of in the name of the people. And then in terms of, I'm sorry, I forgot local government. Yeah, local government uses secrecy all the time. And I used to be a reporter, and I would go to city council meetings, and they all the time would be like, we're going in executive session and you have to leave. So I mean, it's definitely not unique to more national governments, though I think people often are more concerned about it at the national level, and the way that it's talked about in early America in particular is that not only are you going to shut the doors and we won't know what's going on, but already you're taking these representatives really far away from us and in this kind of capital city, and we don't know what's happening there. And the distance would be another factor that would contribute to them not knowing what was going on. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk.
Thanks.
It was very interesting. I have a comment and a question. My comment picks up on some of the questions that were asked before. It seems to me that publicity in the French case could have been used as a form of protection against the king. These very large, unruly assemblies must have been really hard to shut down. So I found that interesting.
Yeah.
And my question is about contemporary legacies. So do you see traces of these dynamics today in the way that politics is conducted in the U.S. and France? And if so, is the U.S. system more favorable to secrecy today? I would think intuitively that it's the opposite compared to France today. But I just want to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, thanks. I think your first point about publicity being sort of a tool to protect themselves against the monarchy trying to shut them down is absolutely true. So a lot of the deputies felt like, if people, it's kind of, I don't know, maybe a little bit common sense. Like today, people still do this. If a lot of people know about us and what we're doing, it's going to be harder for you. It's going to make it more of a problem for you to try to stop it. And also there's evidence that a lot of deputies kind of felt unsure about what they should do, and they would like write home and say, okay, like what do people think about this before I vote on it? And that there was actually a concern for following kind of like what people wanted them to do, and that they saw having the public in the meetings, at least at the beginning, some of them, as a way to gauge kind of what was popular, what was not, or like demonstrate popular support. Of course, that became really problematic as the revolution went on, because then they're in Paris. The only people who can get there are people in Paris, and it becomes this kind of place where people will pay people to go in and like clap for things, or so it gets kind of corrupted and it becomes problematic. But then the second question about resonances today, I actually think it's just remarkable how similar the debates we have about this today are to what was happening in the 18th century, frankly. We use a lot of the same terminology, and though the technology has changed and ways of rendering things transparent are now kind of much more instantaneous, we still have a lot of these debates along the same lines, and we use a lot of the same language, like democracy dies in darkness. It's a lot of this light and dark. It's a lot of the same, we talk about it in a lot of the same ways. So I think it has direct roots to that. And in terms of the French and American cases, in terms of who is more sort of amenable to secrecy, I don't know where I'd come down on that, only that I think what's really interesting, and where I haven't gone yet, but I'd like to kind of go with research in the future, is with the growth of sort of the bureaucratic state, obviously the ability to maintain secrets, or sort of realms of government activity that are getting carried out outside the public view, are kind of grown exponentially with a bureaucratic professional government. But even like, you know, on the floor of the Senate, you could always watch the floor of the Senate or the House on C-SPAN, but like nothing is happening there. Like everything real is happening, you know, in meetings and not on the Senate or the House floor. So even though you could see that now, it's like the center of what's actually happening has a way of moving outside of public view as more things are open. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but those are my thoughts.
Okay, would you please join me in thanking Dr. Carter for a wonderful talk, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.